has the right to go into any country and do whatever it takes in order to maintain this democracy, and be kind of this hero figure. So kind of like another news context example that I see this kind of cultural hegemony within the media playing out was kind of like we could look at the Vietnam War. So there are a lot of people in the U.S. who are very opposed to the Vietnam War for obvious human rights violations and, amongst other reasons. But, at the same time, there were tons of Americans who thought it was the best thing to be doing, fighting this war in Vietnam, because, again, there's just this idea that, the U.S. could do no wrong. It's just this benevolent force. So the media really played off of this idea and led, most citizens to believe that the U.S. was doing the right thing. They were fighting for democracy. They were fighting for, independence and everything else. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
Does anybody else have anything to say about that?
Yeah.
So like for the hegemony, how like it relates to like U.S. media coverage of things, it's kind of becoming very corporate, because media is now a corporation. Unfortunately, it's very financially motivated. So hegemony is now going from just being like belief based to like money driven, which is a problem. Definitely.
Right. And it's kind of like going off of what you were talking about with the Vietnam War. Like the book discusses how the press will like frame like when the U.S. is like not a benevolent force, like it's like a deviation from the norm. Like, oh, this is like, not typically what is done, like blah blah blah. But like in reality, like they're just like trying to shape in like a way that like shows that like this is not how the U.S. is, but in reality, like it's the complete opposite. So yeah.
There's also like it's not as like overarching and broad as like the thinking about but not benevolent force of the whole U.S. I was thinking more like how the media is kind of portraying police to be a benevolent force, even though there's a lot of problems with them now. Mm-hmm. Like especially like Fox and all the right wing, they're kind of like, oh, police are amazing, police are great, even though they're out like shooting people.
Right, like Blue Lives Matter, like all this stuff.
Again, police fall under that like institutional like hegemony. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, any last thing about question number 1? Or are we ready for 2?
It's good too.
What is the reverse content analysis, and what it tells us about the media's tendency to dig here, not there? My bad. Reverse content analysis refers to the United States' tendency to not fully cover an event, but rather only show side or the side that would make the American people favor the government's decision. There are important stories that were chosen to be admitted. Usually these stories tend to be a part of a larger, untold story of America in the world, the story of the American empire. Stories like this one of the American empire, stories of the social class and political power, and their uneasy truce with democracy.
To like understand like these past media books, or when we got to the topic of media, they were talking, obviously it's a politics class, so all this politics, but I related to like sports, and you see like issues, you see this like the digging here and not there, and they're like trying to find stories during certain times of the year where like, oh, it's not as much going on, so they have to find stories inside of stories. So when you watch like Undisputed or First Take, those are my favorites, by the way. Just I can tell y'all that. Like every year, it's the question of, oh, the Patriots are falling off. That's not my favorite team, but I'm gonna tell you, like the tiniest thing can happen. Like last off season, like they lost their defensive, their left tackle, Nate Solder. He went to the Giants. Oh, now all this is happening in the Patriots organization. Now, like this is gonna be the end of the dynasty, and he just got traded. It wasn't the end of the world. Like, so they're creating stories out of nothing. They take one thing and they kind of use it to say that something else is happening, kind of in a way. But they leave out like other things, like, oh, in the end he wasn't really good on the Giants, so like that didn't make any sense. Or in the end, like left for this reason instead of this reason, X, Y, and Z, and like it's no issues in the locker room or any of that stuff. They don't say all of that. Like they just cover one thing and then they run with it, and all the shows run with it, no matter what channel you turn it to. Or like the LeBron issue, for instance. All that's just going on. But that's how I understand all these books because I related to sports.
True.
Yeah.
That'd be like generally during the summer when it's just like
Yeah,
baseball's
with
going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Nothing at all.
A lot of people don't want to watch baseball highlights, so they gotta find off-season
Mhm.
stories and whatnot.
Yeah, I thought in like relation to the book how they talked about when they were like at war, they spun it as all of our like soldiers and stuff were like heroes and were doing so
Yep.
good well and blah blah, but they didn't talk about how many like, casualties had died and how they were like killing so many just like children and women and like there was like hundreds of thousands, but they were just like we're doing great and everyone's
Yeah.
like making it better.
Yeah, and the
That's-
other thing is they were only using quotes from like American officials or like American
Yeah.
soldiers, you know.
Yeah,
Right.
I'll talk about that in my question. But so yeah, talking about like anytime they're in the Middle East, they're there as peacekeepers, or like in Afghanistan, it was for peacekeeping, really for oil, but
Yeah.
they don't talk about that. And the same thing actually, they talked a little bit about the recession, how these like big corporate news agencies and news groups weren't covering the stories that showed the real causes of the recession. They were just kind of like dancing around it because they didn't want to, get their buddies in trouble. So it's that kind of stuff.
In like a smaller context, there's like the media digging in the wrong place when it comes to like presidential elections, like 2016, where like the right-wing media's all kind of ignored all of Trump's stupid shit and all went towards Hillary's emails, even though they weren't as bad as they were playing them out to be, and Trump was doing a hell of a lot worse shit.
Mhm.
Also downplaying what he was saying or doing. Like, oh,
Like explaining it away,
Yeah.
Like sexual assault's not a big
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah.
Like they always had a scapegoat. That's
Yeah.
what I think this whole thing is like they always use a scapegoat to get away from like the real topics.
Yeah.
He would start a whole other scandal.
Yeah.
Start
Yeah.
a whole other scandal to get like people's attention away from something else that was going on.
I feel like this question in particular is like the thing that keeps the media going. In a
Right.
sense,
Yeah.
like this is like what they live and die off of. If, like they can't do this one thing right here, like based on like digging what's not there, then what is there to do? Especially this day and age, like people like you just gotta give me something. I need something right now. Make something up and then put it out and then we can refute it later.
That goes
Yeah.
to question what was it?
Yeah, no, I was gonna
Oh my bad, I didn't mean to take so much.
Oh,
No.
There's lines to it.
And they, a lot of them tie
Yeah.
They all tie together.
how like on the last question it was talking about how like to maximize profit and stuff and the commercial imperative, like they have to do like all these stories about like murder and like rape
Yeah.
and like all these terrible things to keep like their viewership up and get more money.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
But
We'll go to depth.
number 3.
Yeah, so I have number 3. So what does it mean to view the world in Manichean terms? Relate this to the 4-part story the U.S. media told post 9/11. In doing so, make sure to explain how part of the story played out in the U.S. media. So what, I don't know how to say stuff, but Manichean terms.
Manchian.
Manchean. Okay, I don't know how to speak
Manchean.
English, so yeah, Manchean. It's like talking about how back in the medieval times, the followers of Manes, they thought that the world was just either light or dark, like it was good and evil, and like I feel like our media really tries to frame things like that, especially in the context of the United States. They're like, okay, like going back to like the first or second question or whatever, it's like talking about how like the United States is doing this because we're so just and we're so like so good and like we have the right to do this, but I mean I don't think that we do, but so yeah, so the 4-part story, it was talking about how like our enemies, which is like the Al-Qaeda, like the people that did 9/11, like they were evil and like we are a target of this, even though there was a lot of shit going on like before, like that led up to that. And yeah, I was talking about how the president and the White House, they were the heroes of the struggle between good and evil, and and it was talking about anyone who like disagreed with this, like they were to be condemned, and that like they were just traitors, and that they didn't like they weren't like American, you know, like they didn't believe that even though what they were doing was wrong, like, wait, never mind, forget I said that. So anyway, yeah, so it was also talking about how, like, just facts were forgotten, like how they didn't go into detail about why these attacks happened, and like, they were talking about like the Afghan war and stuff, and, yeah, I lost my train of thought, so if anyone has anything to add.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I feel like post 9/11, the U.S. like really like victimized themselves, and yes, like it's a tragedy, like, you know, something awful just happened to us, but like that doesn't like justify kind of like some of our actions that we like that succeeded that. So yeah, I think it just like really like 9/11 really tried to paint the picture of like, you know, we're the only good guys in the world and like everyone's out to get us. Like in reality, it's like we've done things to, like other countries does things to us. Like, you know, it's not like good and evil. Like, you know, there's somewhere in between. Like, you know what I'm saying? So yeah.
Yeah. They said in like Bush's speech at one point, like they used it to like unionize like the U.S. and that so many times like they would use it to you know. He said in like one of his speeches, he mentioned the 9/11 tragedy and like stuff like every other sentence, and like in the total it was like he used the term like 100 and some times like in his speech. Like they really played on it to like
Yeah, the
get
one guy
everyone.
was quoted, I forget, it was a senator, he said, if you're talking about, this is like only like a few years after 9/11, if you're talking about security or immigration or anything like that, you need to mention 9/11. He said you
Yeah.
need to mention
Yeah.
that, because I think, so this is one of the things that I'm thinking about is, because there's definitely people who really took that shit to heart, like they really felt what happened, and I understand that, but I'm thinking like, you know, there had to have been like a few, like, you know, kind of clever guys who were like, oh, wait, we can do something with this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
Yeah,
I
for
think- I
sure.
think that's what the administration did, because oftentimes when I watch stuff about this, they say this is like the main thing in his presidency is 9/11.
Yeah.
And so if this is the main thing this is the main thing, the whole thing that frames your presidency, this is gonna be like, I don't know how to like say this correctly, but you're gonna have to talk about it. Anytime something tragic happens to the country, then you're obviously the leader. It's your job to, you know, everybody's already scared, so you can play on people's fears and like pretty much force your point, like what your plan of action is down everybody's throat, basically, in a way. And like once, like some people, once they hear like higher ups say something, they take it as like the gospel. Like they are enemies. Oh my God! Like now we all need to
Right.
think that everybody who is Muslim is out to get us, out to like attack us. So like I feel like the fact that this happened and it was such a tragic, you know, tragic event, and now it's like being broadcasted, and the media is there saying this, that, and the third, and now the president's been thrust into the limelight, so to speak. Like, I just feel like this is one of those opportunities where like, I don't know, I just feel like this in particular, like, this is an easy way to get people to go along with your
Yeah.
with your plan based off of fear and the fact that people are dying and everybody's all over. I just feel like this is just too easy.
Yeah.
Too easy
Yeah.
for the media, too
Yeah.
easy for the administration. Like, this is just wow. Like,
Yeah.
Right. Well, because, like, I learned in a different class, like, in a time of crisis, like, you know, the people are going to look to the president. Like, you know, he's supposed to, you know, fix the country, like, make everything better. So it's like, I mean, you know, with the Depression, like, everyone turned to FDR. Like, what do we do? Like, you know, different crises, like, you know, the president has to, like, make a decision to, like, you know, like, how are we going to better the situation? And that's definitely what Bush did. I mean, that was like his defining moment in his presidency, like 9/11. So, I mean, he had to turn all of his attention towards that. And, like, that's where I said, like, we victimize, like, the shit out of ourselves when that happens.
Yeah, I think they mentioned too, like, before 9/11 happened, that, like, Bush hadn't really done much to be, like,
Right.
memorable. If anything, he was kind of criticized for some stuff. Then, like, after 9/11, he took such, like, a spin politically and, like, on people's emotions and stuff that everyone was like, Bush, like, helped us through 9/11. He's, like, remembered
Yeah.
so, like, gloriously now. That, like, before that, really, like, he hadn't done much.
By some people.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the book talked about kind of how like 9/11 helped like the Bush administration create kind of like this mean world syndrome.
Right,
You
right.
know, we're good, and everybody else in the world's mean, and that's why it's okay if we, you know, stay in their countries, have our troops, you know, quarter there, and things like that. And we're kind of seeing like a xenophobic resurgence of that
Oh,
mean
yeah.
world syndrome now.
Oh my
So.
God.
And it's like the US forgets that we have our own extremist groups. Like we like to put the blame on other countries, like, oh yeah, they
Right.
come here, but the white supremacists, like,
Yeah.
You guys see, what's her name, Omar, the senator? She got, Trump published that video of like 9/11 attacks with, cut in with like one of her speeches. And then she like made a post today, like, hey, like, I've been getting so many death threats from this. Like, just within like, 2 days it was posted. And she's like pointing out like, shit's a problem, you know, bad.
Does someone do 4?
Yeah.
I got it. So I'm gonna need some help with it. So this one, yeah. So the Iraq War. The two things that I'm gonna look at was weapons of mass destruction, because they, and then what was the other? Oh yeah, the detainees. So one popular strategy or a tactic that the government had back then was that they had this belief that if they were from a certain country or they had connections to certain people, they were automatically guilty of the conspiracy against the United States. So what they did is they set out like a whole bunch of illegal, just like illegal, I don't know how to say it, like illegal capturing activities where they would round up thousands of Iraqis, you know, and would interrogate them, like pretty much torture them. So that was what this whole Abu Ghraib thing was about. I think Abu Ghraib was like a base where they held all their prisoners, and so that's where like a lot of shit went down.
Right.
And you know, the officials knew what was going on. They were aware of what tactics were being used. So one of the quotes that I took was like, Congress, there was like a small surprise by Donald Rumsfeld at Abu Ghraib. And at all these events, the White House told, and the press reported, that these abuses were the work of a small number of troops who acted in an illegal and improper manner. Because there was like stuff coming out, like, you know, they're doing illegal stuff there. So, you know, the White House would say their spiel, and the press would just, you know, not question it or just report it. And then, so right before this was when the whole weapons of mass destruction thing went on. So the New York Times and the Washington Post, they had to apologize to readers for relying too heavily on official sources, which privileged the story of the weapons of mass destruction above like other stuff that was going on. So even when other stories had compelling evidence that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, they were still
Pushing that.
yeah, right, exactly. So now, along with like the rest of the mainstream press, they again relied heavily on the official sources, privileging their story above the other story. Here again, reporters were fully aware. This is what I was talking about earlier. Okay, here's another quote. Here again, reporters who were fully aware of the capture techniques that were used to round up so many innocent detainees. They still dutifully quoted U.S. officials, so they are deemed to be a security threat through multiple sources. It's that simple. If they were innocent, they wouldn't be at Abu Ghraib. And again, the press just takes it. And so, someone was just talking about like using media officials.
oh yeah.
So one of the things they were talking about is like these, in certain scenarios, like something's going on, you know, like a TV, like a news station will bring on like an expert or like a scientist, something like that. So during this time, you know, they bring on these experts and they would, you know, talk about how, you know, we should probably check on this. Then they would bring in White House officials to just like juxtapose whatever they said and be like, oh, well, okay, there's no problem then.
It kind of goes back to like the last book we read, and they had said, I don't know, I can't remember what the like theory was or whatever the issue was, but they were saying how like a lot of the reporters, they're not specialized in the topic. So they have to bring in, like you see it on TV all the time, they have to bring in these other people because they're just relying on their sources. Even if it's not like completely accurate or whatever, they're relying on their sources to give them the information, but the sources can't give them everything. So when they produce stories, that's why you often see like the backup people there that like try to like make it seem more reliable. They're giving their insight. Oh yeah, like I've studied this for 25 years and I worked here, this place and that place. So that gives their story and their article more like weight. Like this is why you should believe it.
Also, the press
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Also, the press downplayed all the protests and all the important scientist stuff. They would be like, "Oh, the scientist said this," and then like a paragraph later, "Oh, but we read this instead," and the scientist didn't know what they're talking about. But like with the protests, they would like downsize the numbers dramatically and be like, "Oh, it's like a 50,000 person protest," and oh, only like 1,000 people showed up.
Yeah.
Those are made up numbers, obviously.
So that'd be like another example of political spin,
Mhm.
right?
We're still on 4, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of like other examples.
I just know that they also mentioned that that Iraq, or they claimed that Iraq had ties with like international terrorism, and that Iraq, like along with Al Qaeda, like they like really wanted to see the United States being attacked, so they were kind of framing it in that way. They want, like I guess I was saying previously, like they didn't really show like what the United States had done to lead up to that.
Another part of 4 is like how the administration tried to get the other countries involved. The other countries don't give a shit about American media. They did not listen to them.
Yeah.
A word they said. So they were almost all against it. The UN was like, "Don't you dare!" And they did it anyways.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of something more recent.
Oh, I have a recent one.
What is
Just like a spin. I keep going back to the same thing. The police. I don't really think it's cops. It's just what I keep seeing on the news. But they always have a spin against like the young men, like the young black men that get shot. They don't frame them as young black men like they're 12 or 13. They frame them as men.
True.
And they're
Yeah.
like, this man was doing this. No, he was walking down the street
With a water gun.
I feel like
Yeah.
I feel like
with a
another-
cell phone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like another kind of example of that is like how the media / the US government tried to, and still does try to like connect, but not only connect, but equate terrorist organizations like Al Qaeda with the country that they're mainly in, their government.
Yeah.
Al Qaeda is not Iraq,
Right.
you know.
Al-Qaeda's
it's
fighting Iraq.
Right.
Yeah, but from our media's perspective, they posed it to people, years ago as, hey, that's why we're justified in, using drones. Even though we're killing civilians in that country, it's okay because country equals terrorist
Right.
organization.
Right.
Obviously, everyone is there. That's another with the Manchin thing. They showed how the 4-part story in the first one, they showed everyone who's not 100% pro-American is evil, and that somehow translated over to everyone who's not 100% born American, white American, and that's today, unfortunately, it's getting like that too. But it's like if you were Middle Eastern, you were inherently evil, even if you were like born in America. Today, that's a problem too.
I feel like you have to use the like simplest of means. Like since not everybody is like cares about politics, but if something like this happens, like you have to use the stupidest and simplest level of like anything to connect it to why it's justified. So like not everybody's gonna understand the layers of like why you're actually doing it, but just to speak it out to the media, you gotta like say something that remotely makes sense. That way everybody can grab along. Like, oh, they're like this, and we must hate all of them. Like,
Fear.
Yeah,
Everything is
like-
run on fear.
Right.
Yeah.
Media is all fear.
So.
5? Yes, that's okay with me. So what?
I was like, who has 5?
With me. What lessons did the U.S. government learn about keeping the press satisfied on the administration side from U.S. experience during previous wars? What tactics did the government adopt in Iraq to avoid media relations problems experienced in the past? Okay, so in the past, there was unrestricted coverage around the Vietnam War, and there was some Vietnam tragedy that was mentioned, and I missed what it was, I think. But the Pentagon, the government believes that the unrestricted press coverage actually ended up causing the loss and the failure of that war tragedy, whatever happened there. I'm not amazingly familiar with the Vietnam War, and I didn't need to be. But so Pentagon didn't trust the press. They didn't include them in anything before the Iraq War. The press was getting really pissed. They couldn't give the American public like what they needed to hear. That's actually like violating some Constitution stuff. I just learned about that in journalism this morning. I really should pay attention. I'm a great student. So what they did for Iraq is they did embedded reporting, which is where reporters would actually go with units to the war zones, and that ended up causing like shitstorm problems, because if they were so restricted, they couldn't do anything. They couldn't leave the grounds. They could barely walk around the ground, like the fortresses, whatever it's called, compounds, without being like accompanied. And then the units, the heads of the units, could actually censor what the reporters were reporting. They could take the reports and take stuff out, reword it, and then the reporters, they were hostages basically, the military. They had to do what they were told, and only were shown what they wanted to be shown. And so they got a very unrealistic view of what the war zone was like, and they sent that back and gave the public a really unrealistic view. And it also ended up being kind of corrupt, because they, as the book says, fell in love with the units they were with, because they were with them 24/7. They were seeing them as people. They weren't seeing as much of the killing as they should have been. So they ended up spinning it in a much more positive light than they should have. So that created a really, really bad bias. Does anyone else have anything to add?
I never knew what this was, like, until I read that book. I was like, oh, well, that's why I see this all in movies. I always wondered why, like, reporters were, in the war movies, reporters were down there with them. I was like, nobody get killed. Like,
What reporter loves their job that much?
Exactly. I was like, you can't pay me enough. But I never knew that until I was reading this book. But I don't know. Me, personally, you would have to fire me, because I'm not going. I just feel like it's just too...
And if you went unaccompanied, you died.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's just
true.
too
I
much
remember-
risk.
Wasn't that like a offense, like a legal offense, to go on?
It was like they had a lot of restricted, so like if they were going under like with the people, then it was like they couldn't ask them certain things, and the soldiers weren't allowed to answer a lot of questions too.
Yeah, they were called
Yeah.
generals.
So if they were like trying to spin it in any negative way, like they got in trouble, so they had to like everything they said had to be kind of like framed and positive.
So it just backfired again
Yeah.
on the Pentagon's plan. Like,
Okay, this is cool. This editor for the Columbia Journalism Review asked the U.S. Central Command to investigate the cases of unilaterals, or unembedded journalists, who had, they said, been detained by U.S. troops at gunpoint, stripped bare, handcuffs held for more than 48 hours, denied food and water, and beaten when they attempted to speak. En masse, they never heard back from the U.S. Central Command. And when there was some more stuff, U.S. forces fired on the Palestine hotel base camp for unembedded journalists, killing 2 journalists and injuring 3 others. Yeah, no, the U.S. was literally attacking their own people, because they didn't want them giving back the information that they saw.
That was one of the things that we talked about, is this, and I guess it just went all the way up and down, but the commitment to the message. It was one of the things they talked about specifically this is like specifically in the, I guess more in the White House, but it's like they have their own story that they want the media to tell. And so if someone else tries to tell something else, they have sanctions, and I guess, if you go down the military, torture and all that good stuff. I remember watching a few years ago, because I remember they still have journalists going out to the field still. And there was one where they were under fire, and the journalist has to like run and hide with the troops while they're fighting. And she's like trying to like talk and ask what's going on, and the guy's like, hang on a second. Yeah, it's crazy. That's a tough job.
Yeah. That should be like, they should be employed. Well, that puts like a conflict of interest. Like I said, they should be employed by the military. They should be trained with military.
They
But then
were.
it's a conflict
Yeah,
of
so
interest,
they
right?
went through a little training.
There was like
Yeah.
600 of them, and that was the Pentagon's plan. They took 600 journalists, trained them in like military and like the military equipment, and if you were good enough, you went in there with them.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was thinking more like a full boot camp. That's
They said it was like a mini boot camp.
Yeah,
Probably
I think it was like a
yeah,
few
it could
days.
mean anything from like
Yeah.
a couple weeks. These guys took years.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else on that one?
All right, well, I have 6. The author details the ways that the media helped, quote-unquote, stage the stories the government wanted to tell, thereby collaborating in a way that carefully cultivated half-truths about the war. Described.
You want to record them?
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I was
Sure.
thinking.
Describe 2 of these staged collaborations. So for this one, I thought like that really in chapter 4 it talks a lot about it, especially for one of them how they tell like the half truths. It's it talks about a story about how a woman soldier when they had nighttime recording that was kind of fuzzy of her getting like coming out on this really dramatic stretcher, and it like zooms in on her face and she's like looking heroic and like it says like she looked pretty or something, and they like showed it to the public and was like, you know, your soldier is fighting for you, and like pegged her this heroic, and like how she just like went in and like was helping and got saved or something. And then they kind of like dropped the story, so it was like this fast clip of like someone doing something heroic, and then they should kind of let the public believe that. Then everyone was kind of like, oh, like whatever happened to her after she was like taken away on this stretcher in this ambulance. And then they had someone like go back a few weeks later and kind of like dig back into it and found out she wasn't even doing anything heroic, like she'd just been hit by a truck. And so she was like injured and coming out of that, but they were trying to peg it as she just like saved her life for these people, and they're like, she just got hit by a truck. You know.
True.
And then another one they talked about how it was like really staged was an example in the, where is it? They called it the Frito Square, where like the statue and everything was, and they said they used camera angles to make it look like a lot of people were there, and that these people were like for it and everything, and that in fact like it was just the camera angles they were using, and they were trying to make it look like hundreds of people were there, but really it was like 30 or something.
Didn't they do that for Trump's inauguration too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, they definitely did that.
Yeah, and so for a lot of it too, it was like people they had used the same day for another kind of like posted situation, and they were kind of like, hey, come get in this photo, and so they were trying to make it look like some big supported thing, and it was like not, it was like all staged.
Yeah, and I know it was talking about how this event just happened to be in front of a hotel where like a bunch of like journalists were staying, and I think I didn't write this down, but I think it was saying that these events were like staged by like the CIA and like whoever else, like whatever, but yeah.
I thought one that was interesting is that there was says a PR firm known as the Lincoln Group. They created a pro-U.S. news and like a news source or like station or whatever, and bribed Iraqi news editors to run it as their own copy. Yeah, I thought that was pretty crazy.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I guess just another thing they were using that was turning it more squared, or I guess they were telling the half truth was, I don't know if you guys remember the name, but like we were using some type of bombs. They like really were like injuring people, but we were like, oh, America just has these like bombs that we're using, but in fact they were like, when they like, you know, threw them or whatever, like they were like killing a bunch of children and women and like accidentally killed a bunch of people. And that they were saying like, oh, they didn't hear the warnings, but it was like in fact that they like did, and it was like America's mistake, and they actually like injured and killed all these people when they were trying to play it like, oh, we didn't actually just kill all these people, like they just didn't hear us, like they kind of like played it off.
There's also like, I don't know if it's mentioned in a later question or where it was in the book, I know, but they were talking about how they were going in and seeing all these like chemical factories and gas factories, and the media was saying, oh my god, we found a gas factory and we shut it down, it's not a problem anymore. It was never a gas factory to begin with.
Yeah.
Or chemical, I guess. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 7.
We're ready for the next.
Okay. Oh, wait, does anyone have like the questions? I can remember. Okay. So, the Bush administration faced 2 potential scandals in the midst of the Iraq War, Abu Ghraib and a high civilian death toll for each one, explaining 2 specific ways that the U.S. media framed the stories in a way that helped the Bush administration rebound from initial dips in public support. So the first incident that they talk about was Abu Ghraib, and that was basically when interrogators were using like torture methods on detainees, and I think like pictures got out or
Yeah, I
something.
actually looked them up.
Yeah.
They were, like,
They were like, oh my god,
Yeah.
so bad.
I like couldn't believe that, like, and they were like smiling. And,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
It was.
Oh, yeah.
I like had to like shut it.
It
my
was
computer,
bad.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was bad.
It was really bad.
So basically, what the media did, they like helped like it not be tied to like the administration. So like, I mean, even in like the words that they were using, like they just said like, oh, it was abuse. Like they never actually used the word like torture. And then they said that it was a small number of troops who acted illegally, and that like basically like, you know, the administration had nothing to do with it. And then also the book like talked about like like spin machine, and basically how after this happened, like, you know, the White House like took like photo ops and like the Rose Garden and like had like televised interviews, and they basically tried to like turn the attention like away from it. And it was like even saying how, yeah, like the New York Times, like Washington Post, like, you know, very popular like news outlets, like, you know, they very rarely use the word torture. Like, I mean, it was referenced like a couple times after like the photos came out, but then it like died down. They were basically just like, oh, like this was like illegal work from, you know, the troops. Like, you know, we didn't order this. Like, and that was completely on them and all this stuff. And they basically like failed to express like both sides of the story, which was like, you know, the United States like imposing like torture methods on detainees, and I'm pretty sure like it was like saying how like they were like innocent too. Yeah. Like the detainees like weren't even charged with anything, so it was like basically they went through all of that for nothing. Like they were let go. So, and then does anyone have anything on that? You guys want to add something?
Well, they even said like the pure amount of people that they had was false.
Right.
The officials were saying like those numbers aren't right. There's no way those are inflated. And they were like, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, they said they were like lying about their casualties. So they were like, oh, it's only like X amount, and then it was actually like 10 times as much as that. And then like
Yeah.
that number came out, and then it was like even more, and they kept being like, oops.
Yeah.
I guess like during all this, like the media was trying really, really, really hard to push like positive things, like super like the president meeting a sick child, or like the smallest, stupidest things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, and then the next incident was the high civilian death toll. So basically, it was like this British medical journal, the Lancet. They like did like a study, and they released how many like Iraqis were like killed as a result like of the war, and like the number that they like put out was like astounding. Like it was like thousands upon thousands, and like. So basically the book was saying how like ABC, CBS, Fox News, they never even mentioned the study. Like they didn't talk about it at all. And then like NBC covered 21 seconds of it and CNN 14 seconds. And it was like basically the vast majority of like the nation's newspapers, like they never even talked about the study at all. And then, so that was in 2004. So in 2006, there was another study that was conducted, and the death rate was at 655,000. But basically the right-wing media attacked the study because I can't remember exactly what happened.
They were saying that the study was unreliable because the war had kept researchers. They said that the war had kept like the researchers to going to certain sites, but that wasn't true. They visited like all 33 sites.
Right.
And they even went to Fallujah, which was like a really, really dangerous place. And oh yeah, and it was talking about how the confidence interval was really big, but that was because it was talking about how the budget was smaller than they would have preferred, so their sample size wasn't as large as they would have wanted. So it was between like 8,000 and 194,000. So they're like, oh, they just picked in the middle. It was actually 10,000, but. Yeah, they just like ran with that and were like, no, like it's super inaccurate. But like the way that it's its form. It's like a, you know, like a bell curve.
Right,
So
right.
it's like, what was it, like, I don't know, oh yeah, it's a 2% chance that the correct number was as low as 8,000, and then 90% chance that it was 44,000 and above. So, yeah, so they definitely like were like, oh, it's just like from least to greatest, like they just went in the middle, but you know, like the way
Yeah.
that those go, it's not like that. So, yeah.
So basically, like after that one, Lancet did like another one, and that the right wing media like basically attacked the study and saying that because of like the previous study, like you said, they said it was like unreliable and stuff. They were just like, oh, like we can't trust this and like discredit them. And they also said that like if you like agreed with it, it was like liberal bias. Like, yeah, so yeah, the media did not do well with these two, like running these stories.
What is meant by the media's commercial imperative? We discussed three new challenges the media is facing regarding the commercial imperative. Discuss three ways that the United States media operates in order to minimize costs and or maximize profits in response to the rising challenges to the commercial imperative. So, I guess the commercial imperative, like they said earlier in the book, media is now like a business. So their main goal right now is to make a profit like any other business. The new ways to operate, they cut employees, got rid of investigative journalists and foreign-based journalists, and then foreign-based journalist stories that dealt with war. They started like promoting those. And new challenges like the decline in newspapers, which is like a decline in the audience, ad revenue, and like also they're not selling as well on the stock. Their stock is not selling well. And this question like parallel to the other book, like literally it was kind of like what they were saying in the last book to now, and then what the teacher was saying in class is kind of the same thing, which is true because you see a lot of media places, like you always see reports about massive layoffs going on here and there, and like ESPN or like other newspapers around the world is closing down. So like now it's not a lot of journalists, and the teacher said also that the decline in investigative journaling has gone out, and the book had mentioned that because it costs so much to to actually investigate a certain situation, and it's so time consuming, and nowadays people want stories like this, and they're under a certain deadline to get a story out, and if they don't produce their story, then you know that affects how they get paid. People, advertising companies are advertising online or like on videos every 4 seconds. It's on YouTube. It's like another ad. They don't need newspapers anymore. Not as many people read the newspapers as they used to. So now you see kind of too little, too late. Newspapers are switching to the to online, which is tragic. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the part that got with me was the investigative journalist part, because like I said, I relate like all of this stuff, like while I do understand what the book is saying, I always relate it back to sports, because it helps me remember it better. And I was watching First Take the other day, and they literally were saying like now it's like a lot of people entering the field of sports journalism where they don't have a journalism background. They're like analysts, and like one of my favorites is Stephen A. Smith. He said he comes from the day where you had to literally go inside of the locker rooms. You had to go inside and be in the field. Sorry. I lost my glasses, so I think that's the people who found them. So that's why I can't see the screen. But like you actually have to go into the field and you have to break stories. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, there's not a lot of people who do that anymore. It's just people who claim that who can somewhat put this story together and get it out. And it's like, it causes like a lot of readers to be like turned off, so to speak, by certain newspapers and stuff, because the information you're getting is not always the full story. It's not reliable. But whatever saves you the most money and maximizes profit, that's the way to go nowadays. Forget everything else. Forget about the product. Mm-hmm. This is whatever you can make money, which is tragic. but hey, I guess it is what it is.
I feel like another challenge that like the media is facing is that like people's attention spans are just like shortening and shortening as like technology and like instant gratification just grows, and I feel like that's a huge challenge because you know we just need a sound bite to get people to pay attention, keeping attention.
One of the things is that you can't offend your audience. And
Nowadays.
now,
That's
yeah,
too easy.
like,
Oh,
how
yeah.
do you do that?
Yeah,
How
the
do you
book
not
said,
do that?
Yeah, the book
Yeah.
said, "Do not bore and do not offend" was like the principle.
Like, you're offending someone one way or another, you know? But that like completely ends up distorting the truth,
Yep.
which sucks.
I'm gonna use BuzzFeed in 2 examples here. What the book said is like another way to maximize profits, to put entertainment above all the like real topics. And like if you go on BuzzFeed and it's gonna be like cooking and then a quiz and then Kardashian and then more Kardashian and more Kardashian, and eventually you'll get to like the Notre Dame fire. But then you also think about people nowadays don't know enough, don't care enough to know enough about what's a good source. So a lot of people actually believe a lot of the stuff coming out of BuzzFeed. And it's not always wrong, but it's not always great.
Yeah.
My teacher just laughs. I'm in journalism class, and he just laughs.
At what?
BuzzFeed.
Okay,
He's like, this is
Good.
ridiculous.
good.
Anything else on that question 8? What last thoughts?
Anything on the book?
Oh, such a good book.
Yeah, it was really nice
Yeah.
Sunday reading.
Yep.
Right. We done?
Yeah.
That's good.